After Bill Clinton's crisis of merit, the 21st century brought with it its own challenges that span well beyond the president's personal assistance. There's no other modern-day tragedy that compares to the optics and rhetoric behind the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. With their high publicity and ability to penetrate the hearts and minds of all Americans, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, was charged with not just the economic concerns behind the Pentagon and World Trade Center being struck, but the mass calling of action from an increasingly emotional and skeptical public. In the following days, weeks, and years, President Bush had multiple speeches, each with their own goals and intended audiences, though at the time, the whole world was the audience. On September 11, 2001, the evening of the terrorist attacks, the President's address to the nation was aired. In this address, Bush immediately acknowledges that the United States is under attack and with a solemn tone mourns the loss of many. Throughout, Bush pushes an emotional response, with stark descriptions of fires and buildings collapsing just earlier that day. This was furthered by his repeated use of metaphors to unite the public.
A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
However, the emotional nature of the speech is not one entirely of mourning and unification, for there are moments of anger spread throughout, with repeated references to enemies, as well as the first mention of the war against terrorism. This would soon become known as the War on Terror. This was highly effective at uniting the American public in a time of immense fear and uncertainty. It presented the people with an enemy that, while not identified at the time, was a target for their anger to be directed. The aims were to limit chaos and uncertainty while upholding and justifying the powers that would be used in the coming decades. 9 days after, on September 20th, the President addressed a joint session of Congress for the State of the Union. This speech would once again be seen as an extreme success among the American public, where his approval rating reached 90% across the country, something that is unimaginable in the current political climate. While Bush continued to speak about the resilience of our nation, the courageous efforts of our first responders, and the time of mourning we had entered, the emphasis was now placed somewhere else.
Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Our grief has turned to anger, and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Bush, in this speech, continues to set the tone for military action by now labeling an enemy, Al-Qaeda, as well as who is harboring them, the Taliban in Afghanistan. The body of the speech is filled with depictions of savagery of Al-Qaeda and threats to any of those who support them. He also accurately predicts that the coming war on terror, now coined, will not be like anything the country had seen recently.
It will not look like the air war above Kosovo 2 years ago, where no ground troops were used and not a single American was lost in combat. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen.
The war in Afghanistan went on to end 172,000 human lives and cost the U.S. over $2 trillion. The President naturally begins to widen down the speech with addresses to the economic stakeholders, asking for continued faith in the U.S. economy. So why are these speeches seen as so successful? Well, it is likely that the nature of the crisis brought an elevated level of fear to the equation. The visuals of 9/11 are notoriously horrifying, with new angles and videos being released to this day. These optics play closely with the terror management theory, which suggests that humans' awareness of their own mortality plays a large role in the behaviors and emotional regulation. George Bush was also a considerably charismatic person in his speeches, with the especially effective use of metaphor to invoke emotional responses in his audiences. Could you imagine the feelings that are present as your whole family gathers to see what the President of the United States has to say after watching the towers fall just that morning? A study conducted by Eric Loeb in 2008 found that charisma played a large part of audience speech reception, but when asked to think about their own death, as many likely were on 9/11, support for their leader was much more likely no matter their charisma. This not only supports why Bush's speeches were so well received, but also reinforces the idea that the fear of death is a tool that may be used for control. This was surely known by the Bush administration as the term war on terror was plastered across the nation. While the long-term impacts of Bush's peddling of the war on terror are, in recent times, seen as moments of useless suffering and political leverage, these were powerful and moving speeches at the time, helping with the spread of the ideologies within. Despite the agenda, there were clear themes of love for one another and our allies, strengthening cultural and economic ties. This would be the least polarized the U.S. government and the public would be for many coming years. With unprecedented global change in an increasingly divided U.S., Trump has used this as a moment to spread mistrust in our institutions in a time of crisis. Looking specifically at Trump's responses to COVID-19 as well as natural disasters, it is important to look out for moments of, if Trump was not in power, then it was not possible. COVID-19 came just over 100 years after the U.S.'s most recent pandemic of such scale, the Spanish flu, making it a time for Trump to lead the genre of crisis responses for disease outbreaks. What is also unique about this crisis is that it was not just a point event, as in it spanned multiple years. This makes it much easier to adjust strategies throughout to best fit the chosen agenda. The capitalization on crisis and political division was first used to begin to build distrust in institutions, but was not his first step. It started with individual actors and government advisors. Trump began with suppressing their concerns surrounding the administration's handling of the virus. While in his speeches, he claimed that there was nothing to fear and that his administration was doing as much as possible to handle the crisis. However, when the pandemic inevitably got worse, in December of 2020, when per-day cases were reaching 200,000, Trump began to lean into the polarization within Congress, allowing more room for him to stuff defiant advisors into the them box. Here is the first few seconds of one of Trump's addresses regarding COVID relief made in December 2020, just before the highest death month in the U.S.
Throughout the summer, Democrats cruelly blocked COVID relief legislation in an effort to advance their extreme left-wing agenda and influence the election.
Truly a president for all. Trump has continued to expand on this strategy in his second term with as much as he can get his hands on. It seems that instead of fighting for unity during a crisis, stirring the pot has been a much more effective strategy. So much so that there is an argument that there have been false crises that are used to spread fear and division that only he is willing and capable of fixing. To show agenda's best, it may be nice to use a crisis that is not new to any president, like hurricane recovery. On January 24th of 2025, fresh into his second term, Trump visited Fletcher, North Carolina for a speech regarding the recovery efforts in place for Hurricane Helene, which made landfall on September 26th of 2024. Trump, throughout his speech, makes claims of large efforts being made by him and his administration to expand rebuilding efforts while criticizing the efforts of organizations like FEMA.
And FEMA's turned out to be a disaster. And you could go back a long way. You could go back to Louisiana. You could go back to some of the things that took place in Texas. It turns out to be the state that ends up doing the work. It's just complicated. And you're going to be very thankful. And you've already seen, I know that it really began 4 days ago, but you've already seen more action than you have in the last 3 months.
This language, combined with constant self-compliments, is one of the strongest examples of the shift towards crises being a time to attack internal features of the U.S., as if it is not the U.S. government that is there to help, but Trump alone. Much of the momentum that is driving genre change has been put into effect by Trump, and it is exactly this momentum that is extremely important to identify. By identifying the motives and the current restrictions, we may be able to predict what comes next in Trump's and future presidents' rhetorical strategies and how they may handle crises beyond just what they have to say about them.